The movie begins in the suburbs at the Sumer household, where a typical morning unfolds. Connie is getting her son, Charlie, ready for school while her husband, Edward, talks about how they should have bought a house earlier when prices were lower. After Edward and Charlie leave, Connie prepares herself and heads into the city. While there, she shops for Charlie's upcoming birthday party. As she navigates through the windy streets, she bumps into a man named Paul, causing her things to scatter. Paul helps her gather everything and notices some scratches on Connie's legs. He offers to let her come up to his apartment to clean the wounds, and Connie agrees. Once she's finished tending to her scratches, Connie thanks Paul and prepares to leave. Before she goes, Paul offers her a book from his collection as a memento. She accepts the book and his phone number, and Paul tells her to visit him anytime she needs more books or medical care. That evening, Connie mentions the encounter to Edward, who jokingly suggests they send the man a bottle of cheap wine as thanks. Connie laughs it off but still considers it. Later that night, Edward is playing with his new camera when Connie approaches him, initiating an intimate moment. The next day, after sending Charlie to school, Connie contemplates calling Paul. She eventually does, telling him she wanted to thank him. Paul invites her over for coffee, and though hesitant, Connie agrees to visit his apartment. When she arrives, she notices a book in Braille, and Paul guides her hand to feel the pages. As his grip tightens on her hand, Connie decides to leave. After leaving Paul's apartment, Connie heads straight to Edward's office, where she gives him a jumper she bought for him. Edward tries it on, showing off for her, and Connie shares an auction opportunity she's excited about. Later that night, after the family has dinner, and while Edward is cleaning up, Connie finds her thoughts drifting back to Paul's apartment. The next day, Connie returns to Paul's place, bringing muffins with her. Paul takes her coat and leads her to sway gently to the music playing in the background. Before things escalate, Connie stops and tells Paul it's a mistake, deciding to leave. However, she quickly returns, having forgotten her coat. This time, Paul embraces her, and they move to the bedroom. Connie doesn't resist him. Meanwhile, Edward meets with Bob to ask about the auction, only to find that Bob has no idea what he's talking about. Later that evening, Edward begins acting strangely around Connie. He asks her if she loves him, and she immediately reassures him with a yes. This seems to calm Edward down, and he tells her that he'll join her in bed in a minute. Over the following days, Connie leads a double life. She plays the role of a devoted mother to Charlie and a loving wife to Edward, especially during Sunday brunches with their neighbors. At the same time, she continues her affair with Paul during the week. One day, while Connie and Paul are at a cafe, Paul makes a bet on who will pay among two men seated at a nearby table. He declares that if he wins, he'll kiss Connie in public as his prize. Paul wins the bet and kisses her. Unbeknownst to Connie, one of the men turns out to be Edward's colleague, Bill, who notices her getting close with Paul. Later that evening, Connie is enjoying a relaxing bath with Paul's choice of music playing softly in the background. Edward joins her in the bathroom, and Connie makes room for him in the tub. However, when Edward attempts to get intimate, Connie pulls away, saying the water has gone cold. She leaves Edward in the bathtub and heads to their bedroom. The next day, Edward suggests they have lunch together. Connie tries to brush it off, claiming she has errands to run for the auction. Edward notices a new satin dress and heels set aside on a chair. He then tells Connie that he'll wait for her to get ready so they can go out for lunch. Just when Edward thinks she'll agree, Connie informs him that she has a facial appointment at 12:30, making lunch impossible. Later that day, suspicious Edward calls the salon to confirm the appointment, only to discover that there is no booking under Connie's name. After Edward heads to work, Connie goes into the city to meet Paul. On her way, she runs into an old friend, Tracy, who is with their mutual friend, Sally. Tracy insists that Connie join them for coffee, and though she tries to decline, Connie eventually gives in. While at the cafe, Connie calls Paul to let him know she'll be late, as she's catching up with old friends. A few minutes later, Paul unexpectedly shows up at the cafe and signals for Connie to meet him in the back. Connie excuses herself from her friends and meets with Paul, where the two of them have a brief, passionate moment in the bathroom. When Connie returns to the table, Tracy and Sally talk about the attractive man they've just noticed and point out Paul to Connie. Sally admits she'd take a risk for a guy like him, but Tracy warns that all affairs end badly. Connie and Sally realize Tracy is speaking from personal experience. Tracy confesses that the one thing she wishes she could undo is her own affair. Meanwhile, at Edward's office, he has to let Bill go due to some internal issues. Bill begs for another chance, mentioning he has a family to support, but Edward remains firm. Before leaving in a rage, Bill cryptically tells Edward to take a closer look at his own family. This remark further fuels Edward's growing suspicions about Connie. Later, Edward meets with a man named Frank and hires him to follow Connie to see what she's been up to. That night, during dinner, Edward casually mentions that he'll be flying to Chicago for a meeting the next day. He also tells Connie that he had to let Bill go because he could no longer trust him. The word trust catches Connie off guard, but she quickly regains her composure. The next day, Edward quietly leaves for his supposed meeting, while Connie dresses up for another day out with Paul. Unbeknownst to them, Frank is trailing them through the city, photographing their every move like two lovebirds. Connie becomes so engrossed in her affair that she forgets to pick Charlie up from school, and guilt starts to gnaw at her. The following day, Edward meets Frank at a secluded spot. Frank hands Edward the photos he's taken of Connie and Paul, along with Paul's name, his apartment address, and the exact times Connie has been meeting him. Edward struggles to accept that his wife has been unfaithful, but the pictures are undeniable proof. One day, while Connie is out grocery shopping, she spots Paul with another woman. Enraged, Connie later confronts Paul at his apartment. Paul assures her that the woman is just a friend, but Connie, filled with jealousy and anger, tells him it's over. Paul refuses to let her go, grabbing her in the hallway. Despite Connie's attempts to resist, Paul holds on to her, and they share another heated moment. Later in the day, Edward pays a visit to Paul's apartment. Paul is puzzled at first but understands when Edward introduces himself as Connie's husband. Edward asks if he can come in, and Paul wordlessly opens the door. Edward begins questioning Paul about their affair. Paul is open and honest in his responses, and the conversation seems to be going relatively smoothly until Edward notices the snow globe he had gifted Connie sitting on Paul's side table. At that moment, something snaps inside Edward. In a fit of rage, he grabs the snow globe and repeatedly strikes Paul's head until Paul begins to bleed profusely. With so much blood loss, Paul dies right there. Once Edward regains his senses, he's horrified to see Paul's lifeless body. Panicking, he starts to clean up the mess. While doing so, he hears a voicemail from Connie telling Paul that she's ending the affair. Edward quickly deletes the message. After cleaning up, Edward wraps Paul's body and puts it in the trunk of his car. Despite the body in his trunk, Edward drives to Charlie's school for his play. Though visibly shaken from the day's events, Edward and Connie enjoy watching their son perform. After the play, Connie tells Edward she needs to stay behind to help with the cleanup, and Edward takes Charlie home. Later that night, when Connie and Charlie are asleep, Edward sneaks out to a river and dumps Paul's body there. The next morning, Edward looks disheveled, causing Connie to worry. However, Edward brushes it off and suggests they go back to the city, but Connie declines. Edward heads to work. While he's gone, police officers visit the Summers' home. They inform Connie that Paul's wife has reported him missing. Connie tells them she barely knew Paul and had only bought books from him since he was a book dealer. With no new information, the police leave. A few days later, the police return with news Paul's body has been discovered. Connie is shocked and visibly shaken, which the police notice. They question her about how she knew Paul, and Connie lies, saying she met him at an auction. Edward backs up her story, and the police are satisfied for now and leave. Later that day, while preparing Edward's clothes for the dry cleaners, Connie finds photos of herself and Paul hidden in his belongings. She realizes that Edward has known about the affair all along. That evening, they host a small party at their home. One of the guests picks up a snow globe, and Connie spots the very snow globe she had given to Paul now sitting among their collection. Connie and Edward exchange a meaningful look, and she realizes that Edward has killed Paul. After the guests leave, Connie confronts Edward. He admits that he killed Paul, though it was an accident. Edward then confesses that it was actually her he had wanted to kill in his rage. The two break down, crying, as they realize how far their lives have spiraled out of control. A few days later, on a quiet weekend, Edward is teaching Charlie how to play the piano while Connie goes about her tasks. She stumbles upon a hidden compartment in the snow globe she had given Paul. Inside is a small photo of her, Edward, and baby Charlie, left as an anniversary gift from Edward. She and Edward share a sorrowful glance, recognizing the damage they've caused to their family. Later that day, Connie burns the photos of herself and Paul, watching the flames consume the remnants of her affair. As she stares into the fire, Edward suggests turning himself in to the police, but Connie refuses. She tells Edward they will take things one day at a time and find a way to move forward. Edward agrees and embraces her, as they attempt to salvage their fractured lives. Life seems to return to normal for the Summers. Edward excels at his job and Connie's auction business is thriving. One evening, while driving home from an auction, Edward stops at a red light. Connie quietly suggests that they disappear, move to another country, and take on new identities. As she begins to cry, Edward gently comforts her, but when Connie looks up, she realizes they have stopped in front of a police station.